The phone rang at the worst possible time. The president of the motorcycle club was in the middle of trying to sort out a huge mess. The club's charity barbecue was just 2 days away, and the guy who was supposed to donate all the hamburger buns had just backed out. The whole room was loud, filled with big men in worn-out jeans and leather vests arguing about what to do next. One guy was saying they should just buy the bread themselves, another was saying they should find a new donor, and the whole thing was about to turn into a shouting match. The club president was a big man. He wasn't young anymore, and his hair and beard had more gray in them than black. His hands were rough and covered in old tattoos, each one a story from a life that hadn't been easy. Right now, those hands were holding his head, trying to think. He loved this charity event. It was the 1 week a year everyone in town saw them differently. Not as the scary bikers who rumbled through Main Street, but as the guys who gave away free food and toys to kids who didn't have much. He didn't want to lose that, so when the old landline phone on the wall let out its sharp, jangling ring, he just waved a hand, annoyed. "Somebody get that?" he grumbled, not looking up from the papers scattered on the table, and no one moved. They were all too deep in the bread argument. The phone kept ringing, stubborn and loud. For crying out loud, the president finally sighed. He pushed his heavy chair back, the legs scraping loud against the concrete floor. He walked over to the wall, the sound of his boots echoing. He snatched the receiver. "Yeah," he said, his voice a low growl. He was ready to tell whoever it was to call back later or to take a message or just to go away. But the sound that came through the phone wasn't anything he expected. It was the voice of a little girl. It was so small, so quiet, that for a second he thought he was imagining it. The noise in the room behind him seemed to fade away. He turned his back to the men, putting a finger in his other ear to hear better. "Hello?" he said, and this time his voice wasn't a growl. It was softer. Confused, he heard a tiny, shaky breath on the other end. Then the words, whispered so faintly he had to strain to hear them. Can you come?" The voice was thin with fear. It was the kind of fear that makes a person's bones feel cold. He had heard fear in voices before, but not like this. This was a child's fear. "Who is this?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Where are you, honey?" There was another pause. He could almost hear her thinking, gathering her courage. When she spoke again, her words came out in a rushed, pained whisper. "He said it wouldn't hurt," she said, and the words didn't make sense to him yet. But it does. That sentence hit him in the chest like a physical thing. He said it wouldn't hurt. Before he could ask what she meant, or who he was, the little girl spoke again, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength, like this was the most important thing she had to say. She recited an address. It was a street name he knew. It was way out on the edge of town, past the old factories, in a patch of land filled with mobile homes and trailers. It wasn't a good place. "Please," she whispered, and then there was a soft click. The line went dead. The club president stood there for a long moment, the dull buzz of the dial tone filling his ear. He slowly lowered the phone and placed it back in its cradle. The noise of the room rushed back in. The guys were still arguing about bread and grills and soda. But he didn't hear them. All he could hear was that tiny, broken whisper. He said it wouldn't hurt. He turned around to face the room. His face, usually tough and unreadable, had changed. All the color seemed to have left it. He looked pale, and his eyes had a faraway, serious look that the men hadn't seen in a long time. The argument about the barbecue died down. One by one, the men stopped talking. They looked at their president. They saw how still he was. They saw the look in his eyes. The biggest man in the room, a quiet giant who fixed bikes for a living, was the first to speak. "Boss?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble. "Everything okay? Who was that?" The president blinked, coming back to the room. He looked at the faces of his friends. These were tough men. They had seen fights and hard times. They weren't strangers to trouble. But this was different. This was a kind of trouble that didn't belong in their world of engines and open roads. "That," he said, his voice hoarse, "was a little girl." A silence fell over the clubhouse. It was a thick, heavy silence. "She's asking for help," the president continued. He walked slowly back to the table, but he didn't sit down. He leaned on it, his knuckles pressing into the wood. She gave an address out by the old scrappy trailer park. And she said. He paused, the words feeling strange and awful in his mouth. She said. He said it wouldn't hurt, but it does. For a moment no one moved. No one spoke. Each man was alone with his own thoughts, imagining what those words could mean. The possibilities were all dark, all terrible. A sick feeling settled in the room. The club president straightened up. The confusion and shock on his face were gone, replaced by a hard, clear decision. The charity barbecue, the hamburger buns, the arguments, all of it vanished from his mind. It meant nothing now. "We're going," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. He pointed to three men. First, the quiet giant who fixed things. Then, to a man who had served as a medic a long time ago, the one they called when someone got cut or burned at the garage. Finally, he pointed to the youngest of them, a man with sharp eyes who had grown up in a hard way himself and knew the streets. "We take the cars," the president said. "Not the bikes. We go quiet. We go now." No one argued. The men he'd pointed to just stood up and grabbed their jackets. The others nodded, their faces serious. They understood. This wasn't a show of force. This wasn't about being seen. This was about answering a call. A call from a voice so small it could have been missed. But they had heard it. As the four men walked out of the clubhouse into the cool evening air. The only sound was the jingle of keys. There was no roar of motorcycle engines. No rumble that shook the windows. Tonight, they moved in silence, carrying the echo of a little girl's scared whisper with them, driving into the growing dark toward a place no child should ever have to be. The two cars rolled out of the clubhouse parking lot, their headlights cutting through the purple-gray light of the evening. They didn't speed. They didn't peel out with a screech of tires. They just drove, steady and quiet, like two boats moving on a dark sea. Inside the lead car, the silence was so thick you could almost touch it. The club president was driving. His big hands were tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. He kept seeing the numbers of the address in his mind over and over. He knew the area. Everyone did. It was the kind of place people tried to forget was part of their town. A clump of old trailers and rundown shacks at the end of a potholed road, where the streetlights gave up and the trees grew wild. In the passenger seat sat the man who'd been a medic. He was staring out the window, but he wasn't seeing the shops or the houses passing by. He was thinking about the words. It wouldn't hurt. He'd heard versions of that before, a long time ago, in a different life under a blazing sun far from here. People said things like that when they were trying to be brave, or when someone had lied to them to keep them still. A cold feeling was settling in his stomach. In the back seat, the quiet giant mechanic sat looking at his own rough hands. He was a man who fixed broken things. He understood engines, metal, wires. He could listen to a knock or a sputter and know exactly what was wrong. But a child's voice on a phone? A whisper of pain? That was a kind of broken he didn't know how to fix. It made him feel helpless, and that was a feeling he hated. The young man, in the car behind them, drove alone. His own past was a shadow in his mind. He knew about bad places and the people who lived in them. He knew about promises that were really threats, and about being small and scared in a place that wasn't safe. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. He wasn't sure what they were going to find, but he was sure of one thing. He wouldn't let anyone tell that little girl to be quiet again. The further they drove, the more the town seemed to fall away. The nice stores with bright signs disappeared. The houses with trimmed lawns turned into houses with chain-link fences and cars on blocks in the yard. Then even those faded, and they were on the long, bumpy road that led out to the fields and the woods. The last of the daylight was just a faint orange line on the horizon, like a closing door. Finally, the president slowed the car. "This is the road," he said, his voice low in the quiet car. They turned onto a narrow lane that was more gravel than pavement. The trailers here weren't lined up neat in a park. They were scattered like someone had tossed them down a hillside years ago and never came back. Some had lights on, the weak yellow glow of a single bulb. Others were dark, windows broken, looking empty and sad. They crept along, reading numbers nailed to posts or painted on mailboxes. The numbers were hard to see in the gloom. The tension in the car grew with every yard. What were they walking into? Was it a trap of some kind? Was the girl even real? The president pushed that doubt away. The fear in that voice had been real. That was all that mattered. There, the medic said. Pointing a finger at the end of a rutted dirt driveway sat a trailer. It was old, the kind with faded silver siding that was peeling in long strips. The small porch was sagging on one side. In the dirt yard, a few forgotten toys lay half-buried. A plastic truck with one wheel, a bald baby doll. It looked lonely. The only light came from one small window near the door, casting a weak square of light onto the ground. The president pulled the car over onto the grassy edge of the road, and the car behind him did the same. For a full minute, nobody moved. They just sat there, engine off, looking at the trailer. It was so quiet they could hear the crickets starting their nightly song. The president took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Okay," he said. "Let's do this right. We're not here to smash doors. We're here because a kid called. We see what she needs. We get her help." The others nodded. They got out of the cars, closing the doors as softly as they could. The four big men stood together for a second in the near darkness. They didn't look like a charity committee anymore. In the shadows, they looked like what they were. Large, tough men, walking into an unknown situation. The president led the way up the dirt driveway, his boots making almost no sound on the soft earth. As they got closer, they could see more details. A bag of trash had spilled over by the steps. The screen door was hanging by one hinge. The place felt still but not empty. It felt like a place where people hid. The president walked up the 3 wobbly wooden steps to the door. He didn't pound on it. He made a fist and knocked, 3 firm, solid knocks that sounded loud in the quiet evening. They waited. They heard a shuffle inside, a muttering voice, then the sound of a lock being turned. The inner door opened, and a man stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim light from inside. He was thin, with a shirt that was stained. He squinted out at them, his face suspicious and unfriendly. He smelled of old sweat and something sour, like beer that had dried on a table. "Yeah?" the man said, his voice a dry croak. "What do you want? You lost or something?" He looked at the 4 men on his porch and his eyes widened just a little, but he tried to look tough, puffing out his chest. The president spoke, his voice calm but firm. It was the voice he used when a situation was about to go bad and he needed to keep control. "We got a call," he said simply. The man's face twisted in confusion, then annoyance. "A call? From who?" "Nobody called you. Get off my property." It was then that the president saw her. A flicker of movement inside, behind a worn-out brown sofa. A small face, pale in the shadows, peeking out. Big eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his. One side of her face was in darkness, but he could see enough. He could see that she was holding her body in a way that wasn't right. The little girl from the phone. She was real. And she was hurt. The man in the doorway shifted his weight, trying to block the view inside. But it was too late. All 4 men on the porch had seen the movement, the small shape hiding behind the sofa. The club president kept his eyes on the man's face, but his whole focus was on the little girl in the room behind him. "A little girl called us," the president said, his voice dropping into something low and steady. It was not a question. The man's mouth twitched. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry, nervous cough. "A girl? You're crazy. There's no girl here calling nobody." He started to close the door. "I said get lost." The door moved an inch before it met solid resistance. The quiet giant from the back of the group hadn't made a sound, but he'd stepped forward. He wasn't pushing the door, he wasn't being rough. He had simply placed one of his massive work boots in the gap between the door and the frame. He stood there, a silent, immovable wall. He didn't say a word, just looked at the man with calm, patient eyes. The man in the doorway stared at the boot, then up at the giant's face. The bluster drained out of him, replaced by a flicker of real fear. He let go of the door and took a half step back. It was all the space the medic needed. He moved with a purpose that was gentle but urgent, sliding past the president and the giant into the trailer. He didn't look at the man. He looked only at the spot behind the sofa. The inside of the trailer was close and smelled of old food and dust. The dim light from a single bare bulb made the shadows deep. The medic knelt down on the thin, dirty carpet, trying to make himself small, trying not to be scary. "Hey there," he said, his voice softer than any of his friends had ever heard it. It was the voice he used for frightened animals and, a lifetime ago, for wounded soldiers who were just boys. "My name's not important, but we got your call. We came." From behind the sofa, the little girl slowly peeked out a little more. Her blonde hair was tangled. Her eyes were red from crying. And now, in the dim light, they could all see it clearly. The right side of her face was swollen and discolored, a nasty purple and red bruise that spread from her cheekbone down to her small jaw. But more telling was her left arm. She held it cradled awkwardly against her chest, her tiny fingers curled protectively around it. The way she held it was all wrong. The man from the doorway found his voice again, a whine creeping into it. "She's fine. She's clumsy, that's all. Took a bad fall off the steps this morning. Kids bounce, you know?" The little girl flinched at the sound of his voice, shrinking back. But then her eyes, filled with a pain bigger than just her injuries, found the club president's face. He was still in the doorway, a solid silhouette against the darkening sky. She seemed to find some courage in his stillness. Her whisper filled the tense, quiet room. It was the same whisper from the phone, but now it had a direction. She pointed a small, trembling finger at the man. "He said it wouldn't hurt," she repeated, the words hanging in the stale air. Then she added the new, terrible piece. "He said he knew how to fix it." The medic's blood went cold. He kept his face calm, a gentle smile fixed in place for the girl. "Can you tell me your name, sweetheart?" She hesitated, glancing fearfully at her uncle. When he didn't speak, she looked back at the kind eyes of the kneeling man. "Lily?" she whispered, so quiet it was almost just a breath. "That's a beautiful name, Lily," the medic said. "Can I see your arm? I know a little bit about fixing things, too. I just want to see what happened." Lily looked at her uncle again. The man opened his mouth, but the club president spoke first, his voice a rumble of finality. "Let him look." The man shut his mouth, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Very slowly, Lily unfolded herself. She shuffled out from behind the sofa. She was wearing pajamas that were too small, the sleeves not reaching her wrists. As she moved into the light, the medic's professional, I saw everything. The way she favored the arm, the ghost of old, yellowish bruises on her thin wrist. This wasn't from one fall. He reached out his hands, open and non-threatening. "May I?" She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. His touch was feather-light. His fingers, rough and scarred from work, were incredibly gentle as they probed along her forearm. He didn't need an X-ray. About halfway between her wrist and elbow, he felt it, a slight, unnatural bend under the skin. Clean break. But then his fingers brushed against something else, something rough and wrong. He carefully pushed up the sleeve of her pajama top. What he saw made his stomach turn. Someone had tried to splint the broken bone. They had used a short, crooked piece of wood, maybe from a broken yardstick. They had wrapped it to her arm not with a bandage, but with layer upon layer of thick, gray duct tape. The tape was wound so tightly it was cutting into her skin, which was red and angry-looking. He could see where they had tried to wrap over the swelling, trapping the injury in a hard, unforgiving shell. "He said he knew how," Lily said again, watching his face. A single tear traced a clean line through the dirt on her cheek. "He said doctors ask questions. He said they take kids away and you never come back." Her voice trembled with the echo of the terrible story she'd been told. "He said if I was really still and brave, it wouldn't hurt when he fixed it." The truth of the situation crashed over the men in the room. This wasn't just an accident hidden by a lazy guardian. This was a calculated act of control. The man had broken her arm, or she had broken it and he'd refused real help. Then, to keep his secret, to keep her quiet and trapped, he had performed this awful, painful fix. He had used her fear of being taken away as a weapon, convincing her that his painful, dangerous solution was her only choice. The real injury was the broken bone. But the deeper wound, the one that made the medic's vision blur with a hot, angry tears, was the betrayal, the lie, the isolation of a child told that the very people who could help her were the monsters to fear. The club president understood it all in that moment, too. He saw the cheap, cruel splint. He heard the poison in the words she'd been fed. He looked from Lily's tear-streaked, trusting face to her uncle's face, which was now a mask of defensive guilt and simmering rage. A red, blinding fury rose up in the president's chest. It was a fire that wanted to burn the whole filthy trailer down. He wanted to grab the man and make him feel a fraction of the hurt he'd caused. His hands curled into fists so tight his own bones ached. But then he looked back at Lily. She was watching him. Her eyes were on his face, searching it, looking for what would happen next. In her eyes, he didn't see just a victim. He saw the incredible, fragile bravery it had taken to find a phone number, to dial it, and to whisper for help into a void, not knowing who would answer. She had been brave. She had chosen to trust. He took a long, slow, shuddering breath. The roar of the engine, the smash of a fist, that's what the anger wanted. But that's not what this brave little girl needed. What she needed was to see that the help she called for was safe, that it was calm, that it would not become another scary, violent thing. He unclenched his fists. He gave the smallest nod to the quiet giant by the door, who understood. The giant didn't move toward the uncle. He simply shifted his weight, positioning his broad body more squarely in the doorway. A silent, unspoken message. You're not going anywhere. The president then did something that felt more natural than breathing. He ignored the fuming man completely. He walked over and slowly, carefully, sat down on the dirty floor next to the medic and Lily. He didn't try to touch her. He just sat there, making himself smaller, less imposing. "Lily," he said, his voice a rough but gentle gravel. "What that man told you about doctors, that was a lie." He spoke clearly, looking right at her. "Doctors help, and the people who come with them, they help too. They help kids who are hurt. They help kids who are scared. That's their job." He saw the doubt and fear still in her eyes. The lie had been planted deep. "You were so brave to call," he said. "That was the right thing to do, the bravest thing. Now we're going to call some more people, good people. They're going to fix your arm the right way, and they're going to make sure you're safe." He paused, letting the words sink in. "No one is ever going to tell you not to ask for help again." As he spoke, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't take his eyes off Lily's face as he dialed 3 numbers. 911. He put the phone to his ear, and in that terrible, quiet trailer, his voice was the only sound, promising a little girl that the world wasn't all darkness, that her whisper had been heard, and that help was finally, truly on its way. The silence after the president spoke to the 911 operator was the heaviest kind of quiet. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the little girl's shaky breaths. Full of the angry, trapped energy of her uncle, who was now pacing the small space near the kitchenette like a caged animal, muttering under his breath. Full of the unspoken rage of the 4 big men who filled the small trailer, each of them holding themselves very still, like they were holding back a storm. The president had spoken plainly to the dispatcher. "We need an ambulance and police. A child about 7 years old. She has a broken arm that's been badly splinted, facial bruising. We are at..." And he gave the address again in his clear, low voice. He didn't say who they were. He just said, "We're the ones who called for her." After he hung up, he kept his phone in his hand, not putting it away. It was a signal. Help was coming. This was real. Lily watched him, her eyes huge. The medic was still kneeling beside her, talking to her in that soft, steady voice. He was explaining what would happen next in simple words. "Some very nice people in a big white truck are coming. They have a soft bed for you to lie on. They have better lights. They're going to be so gentle when they take that tape off. okay? They have special scissors that won't touch your skin." The girl listened, but she kept glancing at her uncle. The fear was a habit, deep and worn into her, like a path in the dirt. The uncle finally couldn't take the silence anymore. He stopped pacing and pointed a shaking finger at the president. "You got no right. You're trespassing. She's my kin. I take care of her. You don't know nothing." The president slowly turned his head to look at him. He didn't stand up. He just looked. The look on his face wasn't the explosive anger from before. It was colder. It was a looking through you kind of look, like the man was just a piece of bad furniture. "You stopped taking care of her," the president said, his words measured and final. "The minute you told her a doctor was something to be scared of." The man sputtered, searching for a lie that would stick. "I was protecting her. From the system. They'll put her in some home with strangers. You don't know what it's like." It was the young man, leaning against the wall by the door, who spoke for the first time since entering. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the man's whine like a knife. "I know what it's like." All eyes turned to him. He wasn't looking at the man. He was looking at a spot on the stained wall, seeing something else. "I know what it's like to be in a house where the person who's supposed to keep you safe is the one you're most scared of, where being hurt gets you in trouble for making noise." He finally shifted his gaze to the uncle. His eyes were hard. "You weren't protecting her. You were protecting yourself. From getting in trouble. From people finding out." His words landed in the room with a terrible truth. The uncle had nothing to say. He just glared, his jaw working. Outside, the first distant sound split the night. It wasn't sirens yet. It was the faint, fast thumping of a helicopter blade. Far away but getting closer. A medevac bird, probably passing over, but in the tense quiet of the trailer, it sounded like the approach of judgment. Lily jumped at the sound. The medic gently touched her good shoulder. "That's not for us, sweetie. That's for someone else, far away. Ours will come with quiet lights at first. You'll see." He was right. A few minutes later, the first flicker of red and blue light danced through the grimy window, painting the walls in silent, swirling colors. There was no siren. They had come quiet, just as the bikers had. The president stood up. "I'm going to go meet them, so they know where to go and aren't nervous." He looked at the giant by the door and gave a small nod. The message was clear. You stay with him. The president stepped outside into the cool night air. Felt clean after the stale smell inside. 2 police cruisers and an ambulance were rolling slowly up the dirt road, their lights cutting through the darkness. He walked toward them, his hands held out slightly at his sides, open and non-threatening. A police officer got out first, her hand resting on her belt but not on her weapon. She took in the big man in the leather vest, the 2 cars parked nearby, the dilapidated trailer. Her face was alert, professional. The president spoke before she could. "The little girl is inside. Name's Lily. Her arm is broken. Her uncle tried to splint it himself with duct tape. She's got a bruise on her face. She's scared. My friend, he was a medic, he's in there with her keeping her calm. The uncle is there too. He's not happy, but he's contained." The officer listened, her eyes scanning his face. She saw no aggression, only a deep, tired concern. She nodded. "Okay. You and your friends wait out here. Let us do our jobs." The paramedics were already pulling their gear from the back of the ambulance. A big orange kit, a folded-up stretcher. They followed the officer toward the trailer. The president stood back, watching as they disappeared inside. He felt a strange, hollow feeling. They had answered the call. They had gotten her this far. Now it was out of their hands. Inside the trailer, things happened quickly but calmly. The police officer spoke to the uncle, her voice firm, directing him to step outside with her partner. The uncle went, his shoulders slumped, all the fight gone out of him under the official gaze of the law. The paramedics, a man and a woman, focused entirely on Lily. The woman had a kind smile and a voice like a teacher. "Hi there, Lily. I'm so glad you asked for help. That was really smart." They worked together like a gentle machine. The man carefully cut away the cruel duct tape splint with special blunt-tipped shears, his hands sure and fast. The woman kept talking to Lily, distracting her, asking her about her favorite color, about if she liked dogs or cats. When the tape and stick fell away, the medic who had been with her winced. The skin underneath was a mess of pressure marks and raw, red lines. The gentle swelling of the break was now visible. But Lily let out a small, shuddering sigh. It was the first sign of relief. The terrible, tight pressure was gone. They put a proper, soft splint on her arm, wrapping it in white bandages that looked clean and professional. They checked her face, her eyes, talking to her the whole time. They were the opposite of everything she'd been told. They were calm. They explained everything. They were there to take the pain away, not 'cause they prepared to lift her onto the stretcher. Lily looked around the trailer. Her eyes found the club president, who was now standing in the doorway again, watching. They found the quiet giant, still a silent statue. They found the young man, who gave her the smallest, slightest smile. They found her medic, who nodded at her and said, "See? I told you they were the experts." The paramedics lifted her, the stretcher feeling solid and safe. As they carried her through the narrow door, she turned her head. Her good hand, small and pale, reached out from under the blanket they had tucked around her. She didn't reach for the paramedic. She didn't reach for the police officer. Her hand stretched out toward the club president. Her fingers brushed against the worn, cool leather of his vest, just for a second. It wasn't a grab. It was a touch. Connection. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to .in. That single, silent touch was everything. "Thank you. You came. You were safe." And that's when the tears came. Not loud sobs. Not from Lily. She was being brave. Her tears were quiet ones of relief and exhaustion. The tears came from the tough men around her. The medic's eyes welled up and he turned his head, wiping roughly at his face with the back of his hand. The young man at the wall looked down at his boots, his throat working. The quiet giant blinked very fast, looking up at the ceiling as if searching for a leak, and the club president, standing in the doorway as they carried her past, felt a hot tear trace a path through the dust on his own cheek. He didn't move to wipe it away. It was the truth of it that broke them. The truth in her tiny, bruised face. The truth in her whispered words that had held so much pain. The truth that a child had been so alone, so betrayed, that a phone call to complete strangers was her only hope. And the truth that, for once, that hope had been answered. It was a sadness for what she had endured, and a powerful, overwhelming feeling for the fragile thread of trust she had offered them, which they had carefully, quietly, held onto. The ambulance doors closed with a soft, solid thud. The red and blue lights swept over the scene as it pulled away, carrying the little girl toward a real hospital, toward real help, toward a night that would finally be safe. The four men were left standing in the dirt yard, the darkness feeling different now. The roar of engines was miles away, in another world. Here, there was only the sound of crickets, the murmur of the police officers talking to the uncle by their car, and the silent, shared understanding of what they had just witnessed. A kind of hurt that had nothing to do with broken bones, and a kind of courage they would never forget. The ambulance taillights disappeared down the dark, bumpy road, taking their little pool of red and blue light with them. Suddenly, the yard was just a yard again, lit only by the weak bulb from the trailer window and the headlights of the police cars. The four men stood together in the dirt, not saying anything. The air felt different. It was like they had all been holding their breath for an hour and could finally let it out. But the air they let out was heavy. The quiet was broken by one of the police officers. She walked over to them, her shoes crunching on the gravel. Her partner was putting the uncle into the back of a cruiser. The man didn't look tough anymore. He just looked small and deflated, his head down. The officer stopped in front of the club president. She looked at him, then at the others, really looking at their faces. She saw the wet tracks on the cheeks of the big, tough-looking men. She didn't mention it. "We'll need statements from each of you," she said, her voice not unfriendly, but all business. "What you saw, what you heard. The timeline. It'll help." The president nodded. "Yeah, okay." They gave their statements one at a time, sitting in the open doors of the police cars while the other officer wrote things down in a little notebook. They told it simply. The phone call, the drive, what they saw when the door opened, the splint, the words the girl had said. They didn't add any drama. They didn't need to. The facts were bad enough. When it was the young man's turn, he paused before he started. He looked at the officer. "That man in your car," he said, tilting his head toward the cruiser. "He's gonna say he was scared of the system, that he was trying to protect her. Don't believe him. He was protecting his own skin. He hurt her and then he scared her into silence. That's the truth of it." The officer just nodded, her pen moving across the page. When they were done, the first officer handed the president a card. "This is the number for the social worker who will be on the case. And the case number. You can call tomorrow if you want an update. They won't be able to tell you much, but you'll know they're working on it." She paused. "You did the right thing tonight. A lot of people would have hung up that phone, or talked themselves out of coming." The president just took the card and put it in his pocket. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired and sad. The police cars left, taking the uncle away to be booked and questioned. The four men were alone again in the dark with the empty, sad trailer. For a long minute, nobody moved. They just listened to the crickets. The medic finally broke the silence. "That duct tape," he started, then shook his head, unable to finish the thought. The image of it, wound so tight on her little arm, would stay with him for a long time. The young man kicked at a clump of dirt. "She touched your vest," he said to the president, his voice quiet. "Yeah," the president said, his own voice rough. He could still feel the ghost of that tiny, feather-light touch on the leather. The giant mechanic spoke, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "What happens to her now?" It was the question they were all thinking. They had gotten her out of this trailer. But where did she go? Who did she have? "I don't know," the president said honestly. "But it can't be worse than here." He said it to convince himself as much as the others. "Come on, let's go home." The drive back to the clubhouse was even quieter than the drive out. The anger was gone. The urgency was gone. What was left was a kind of hollowed-out feeling, mixed with a worry that sat deep in their guts. They had done their part, but the story wasn't over for that little girl. Not even close. The next 2 days at the clubhouse were strange. The usual loud noises, the clatter of tools, the rough laughter, the blare of the radio, were all dialed down. Men talked in lower voices. The charity barbecue happened, but it had a different feeling. They still served the food and gave out the toys, but when they saw kids laughing with a hot dog in their hand, their minds went to one little girl in a hospital bed somewhere. They wondered if she had a toy. They wondered if anyone was sitting with her. The president called the number on the card the next afternoon. He was put on hold, then transferred, then told by a polite but busy voice that yes, the child was safe and receiving medical care, and that the case was active. They couldn't tell him more. He hung up and just stared at the wall for a while. Safe. It was a good word, but it felt so small. 3 days after the night at the trailer, the door to the clubhouse opened. It was the police officer from that night. She wasn't in uniform. She was in jeans and a jacket. She looked around, saw the president working on a bike at the back, and walked over. The other men in the room noticed. They stopped what they were doing, watching without making it obvious. The officer leaned against a workbench. "I'm off duty," she said. "So this is just me talking, not the department. Okay?" The president put down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "Okay. I thought you'd want to know a few things," she said. "The girl, Lily, she's okay. The arm is set properly now. She had a mild infection from that tape, but they've got it cleared up with antibiotics. The bruising on her face is fading." The president felt a knot in his chest loosen. Just a little. He nodded, waiting for more. "She's in a temporary foster home. A good one. Experienced people. She's got her own room. She's got stuffed animals." The officer allowed herself a small smile. "The foster mom said she hasn't said much, but she sleeps with the light on and the door open. She's getting used to feeling safe." The young man had drifted over, listening. "What about him?" he asked. The officer's smile faded. "Charges are filed. Child neglect, endangerment, assault. It'll take time, but he won't be seeing her for a very long while, if ever. They're looking for other family, but it doesn't look promising. Her mom's been out of the picture for years." She looked at the president. The social worker said Lily asked a question. She asked if the vest men were okay. The president's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at the greasy rag in his hands. "I also talked to the paramedic who rode in the ambulance with her," the officer continued. "He said she talked a little on the way to the hospital. She told him she saw a flyer for your charity barbecue. It was taped to a phone pole by the bus stop. It had the club's name and this phone number on it for donations." She remembered the number. She said the men on the flyer looked not scary. She said they looked like they could fix things. The room was utterly silent. The flyers, they'd put up hundreds of them all over town. A simple piece of paper asking for hot dog donations. That's how she'd found them. That's how she knew who to call. The officer pushed herself off the workbench. "Like I said, I'm off duty. But I just thought you should know it mattered. What you did." She gave a short nod to the president, and another to the other men who were now gathered around, and then she left. For a long time after she was gone, nobody spoke. The giant mechanic walked over to a bulletin board near the door. Pinned to the center was one of the barbecue flyers. He looked at the picture on it, a blurry photo of the club from last year's event, all of them standing around a grill, smiling awkwardly. He reached out and touched the edge of the paper with one thick finger. The president finally spoke. "We need to do something," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a thought taking shape. Not just for her, but because of her. They didn't have a plan that night, but an idea had been planted. Over the next few weeks, it grew. They talked to the officer who put them in touch with the right people. They filled out paperwork. They had their backgrounds checked, which was a nervous time for some of them. But it all came back clear. 2 months later, the club started something new. It wasn't a yearly barbecue. It was quieter. They partnered with the local family services unit. They became a registered respite transport service. When kids in the system, kids coming from bad places, needed a safe ride to a new home, or to a doctor's appointment, or to a therapy session, the club would provide it. Not on bikes. In big, clean, comfortable cars. The men would drive 2 at a time. They didn't have to talk. They just had to be a calm, safe presence in the front seat. A reminder that not all men with rough hands and tattoos were something to be afraid of. Sometimes they were just guys who showed up when you called. They never saw Lily again. They heard through the quiet grapevine that she was adopted by a family in another county. A good family with a big backyard. They hoped it was true. But her whisper stayed with them. It was in the quiet way they now talked to each other. It was in the new, careful purpose they had when they put on their vests for a transport run. The roar of their bikes was still a sound they loved, but it wasn't the only sound that defined them anymore. Now, there was also the sound of a car door closing gently, and the sound of a peaceful, quiet ride for a kid who had seen too much noise and anger. They had gone out into the dark one night because a little girl told them something hurt. And in helping her, they had fixed a little piece of their own world, too. Not with tools or noise, but with silence, with presence, and with the simple, powerful act of listening to a whisper and deciding, as a group of unlikely men, to answer.